Blessed are those who are persecuted. Next on One Gospel. On the mountainside, he appoints the 12 apostles, heals, and gives a sermon. This comes from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A question to consider while we go through this portion is, why are persecutions reason to celebrate? Seeing the multitudes, he went up to a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. He lifted up his eyes toward his disciples, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, because the kingdom of the God of the heavens is yours. Blessed are those who mourn, because they will be comforted. Blessed are those who weep now, because you shall laugh. Blessed are the meek, because they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger now and thirst for righteousness, because you will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, because they will obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, because they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, because they will be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, because the kingdom of the heavens is theirs. Blessed are you when men will hate you, and when they will exclude you, and when they will revile you, and when they persecute you, and when they will cast out your name as evil, and when they say all kinds of evil against you falsely, for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, and be exceedingly glad, for your reward is great in the heavens. For in this manner they and their fathers persecuted the prophets who were before you. But woe to you who are rich, because you have received your comfort. Woe to you who are full, because you will hunger. Woe to you that laugh now, because you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for their fathers did the same to the false prophets. So we're going to look at this section on persecutions. And you can see in front of you, blue is Matthew, purple is Matthew and Luke, red is just Luke. So you can see just visually looking at this list that it overlaps, but there's a lot of parallel phrases between Matthew and Luke where they're similar, but they're not exactly the same. Jesus explains why his apostles will be hated after his final meal with them.
If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hates you.
Thomas, which is a Gnostic gospel, says,
Blessed are you when you are hated and persecuted. Wherever you have been persecuted, they will find no place. Blessed are they who have been persecuted within themselves. It is they who have truly come to know the Father. Blessed are the hungry, for the belly of him who desires will be filled.
The apostles were arrested and then brought before the Sanhedrin, which is a similar to the Supreme Court, although it was a religious court in its day. And this was very early after Jesus' resurrection. So his words were still almost ringing in their ears. It was that recent. After being beaten or flogged, they actually rejoiced.
And when they had called the apostles and beaten them, they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus, and let them go. And they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name.
In his first epistle, Peter repeats Jesus' association of persecution for righteousness' sake with being blessed.
But and if ye suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye, and be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled.
Thomas, again, a Gnostic gospel, opens the possibility of finding life in suffering.
Blessed is the man who has suffered and found life.
So, we've given you 3 related quotes from this Gnostic gospel, and all of them really kind of point to an idea of persecution as being almost internal, whereas the apostles who lived to see Jesus' suffering, who lived to see their own suffering, there was nothing symbolic about it. There was nothing internal about it, although there's an internal component to how they react to it. But there's a clear dichotomy between the Gnostic experience, which probably developed 200 years later, 150 years later, and the actual apostolic experience. Peter, later in his epistle, associates blessing with being reviled, which is again something that, in this section, besides being persecuted, blessed are you when men revile you. And he again tells the people who he was, he identified himself in that epistle as an elder. So he was speaking to the younger believers in the region of Turkey that letter was originally circulated in. And he was telling them to rejoice.
But rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. If ye be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of the glory and of God resteth upon you. On their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified.
The author of Hebrews, probably Paul, but we don't know, writes to his companions. I say his, I don't even know if the author's male. Writes to the author's companions that they also rejoiced in persecution.
But call to remembrance the former days, in which after ye were illuminated, ye endured a great fight of afflictions, partly whilst ye were made a gazing stock, both by reproaches and afflictions, and partly whilst ye became companions of them that were so used. For ye had compassion of me in my bonds, and took joyfully the spoiling of your goods, knowing in yourselves that ye have in heaven a better and an enduring substance.
This is actually one of the verses that makes you think it very well could have been Paul, because Paul was writing while in prison in multiple letters of his, and so he would refer to it as his bonds. And anyway, Jesus compares their persecution to that of the prophets that preceded them. So when Jesus is speaking to his disciples and just the general public out on this mountain, he's saying that, this is how they, he doesn't say who they are, but the crowd had an idea. He was talking about the religious leaders. This is how they treated the prophets. Later, right before his arrest, Jesus specifically condemns the Pharisees and Torah teachers for their persecution of prophets past and future, culminating in their destruction.
Woe to you, Torah teachers and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the tombs of the righteous, and say, if we'd been there in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in the bloodshed of prophets. Therefore you bear witness to yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. And you fill up the measure of your fathers. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of Gehenna? Therefore look, I send to you prophets and wise men and Torah teachers, and some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues, and persecute from city to city, so that on you may come all the righteous blood poured on the earth, from the blood of Abel the righteous to the blood of Zechariah son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things shall come on this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those sent to you. How often I've wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under the wing, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate.
Among other things, you notice in this passage that he says, I'm going to send to you prophets, wise men, and Torah teachers. That's the people that he was talking to 2 years earlier on this sermon that we're describing right now on the Mount. Those are the people that he was sending. The suffering of different Old Testament prophets, such as Jeremiah and Isaiah, were well known to Jesus and his audience. But when he's talking about this is how the prophets were treated, were there other prophets that he and his audience would have had in mind? Well, the Dead Sea Scroll community, which is likely Essene, which is a branch of Judaism, within their library of texts, they had something called a commentary of Habakkuk, which amongst the writings where they're commenting on the prophet Habakkuk, which is an Old Testament book, they kind of sprinkle in these kind of ambiguous statements that we don't really know exactly what they're talking about, but they knew what they were talking about when they wrote it. So they described a wicked priest. So again, this is like a corrupt religious leader that persecuted their teacher of righteousness, who was the person who authored their the treatise that was like the rules for their community to live by. So this teacher of righteousness, who's unnamed, was persecuted by this corrupt religious leader, and it likely took place in Damascus, which is where their group had actually run away to because they had to flee persecution. The timing of this is unclear. This could have been in the 2nd century BC. This could have been in the 1st century BC. It could have been in the 1st century AD. This could have been right at the time of when Jesus was talking. We don't know, but here's the quote.
This refers to the wicked priest who pursued the teacher of righteousness to destroy him in the heat of his anger at his place of exile. At the time set aside for the repose of the Day of Atonement, he appeared to them to destroy them and to bring them to ruin on the fast day, the Sabbath intended for their repose.
Now, that is a pretty interesting thing to see, because they're celebrating the Day of Atonement, which is not only one of the most important holy days, but it's also a day of rest. And this priest presumably led an army to attack them on this day. And so you wouldn't think a priest would normally lead an army on the Day of Atonement. So it kind of gives you the idea that the Essene calendar was not the same as the calendar that the priests were using in Jerusalem. They were probably taking advantage of the fact that it was not a holy day for them, and it was a holy day for this group of people. But, I'm just totally going off on a tangent, and I apologize. But I think it's a false assumption to just assume that Jesus is only talking about what's written in the Bible, as far as this is how that group of religious leaders, treated the prophets. I think that he was referring to not only what was happening in the Old Testament, but he was referring to their contemporary life. And he was saying, like, hey, they meaning the religious leaders, generation after generation, have oppressed God's true prophets. It's happened in ancient times. It's happened recently. It's going to happen now, and it's going to happen to you. But because it's going to happen to you, you should rejoice, because that means you are on the right side. So Jesus starts this Sermon on the Mount with a whole series of Beatitudes, and we've gone through all of them now. He says it was blessed to be poor, blessed to be mourning, blessed to be hungry. None of those things would be very popular. He's clearly not shooting for, the feel-good prosperity gospel. This was the opposite of the prosperity gospel. He did say, well, then, it's blessed to be a peacemaker, and I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. Everyone wants peace, right? You would think that a peacemaker, someone who's making peace, is going to be able to live at peace in the places where they're making peace. Not so. He says, no, the same group of people, blessed are you when you're being persecuted. And so this takes it to a whole different level of unpopularity. This would not have gone over well in America today. Would not have gone well anywhere. It probably didn't go well there, although he had disciples. And then he had disciples because, he was healing people. And so pretty much they were going to listen to him because they couldn't deny that he wasn't a prophet, even if they didn't know who he really was. And after the blessings, he has a series of woes. We talked about that too. He ends with a very ominous warning because, for those who are being told, blessed are you when you're persecuted, but they're like, maybe if I just lay low. He says, woe to you when all men speak well of you. So where does this go from here? Well, tune in, find out.